All right, good morning. Good to be back in our regular spots. Okay, we're up to Samach Amud Aleph, the Mishnah, Samach Amud Aleph at the bottom of the page. So 60A4. There's a Mishnah on 60A4. Mishnah. Okay, so we're talking about a person who is, well, we'll see in the Mishnah. So Mishai b'Mizrach, a person is in the east of his town. Okay, we'll see. The Gemara is going to change the way to read this Mishnah soon, but the way we're initially going to read this Mishnah is that a person is to the east of the person's town. Okay, V'amar livno, when he tells his son, and the son is just an example, somebody who is acting as his agent, Arav li b'marav, make an Eruv for me in the west of the town, so you can walk westward towards the Eruv 2,000 amos and beyond it, right? So a person, again, is, we'll just have our city, this is north, this is east, this is west, okay? And so at this point, the Gemara is assuming the person is to the east of the town, and he wants to go this direction on Shabbos, and he is unable to set up his Eruv, so he sets up an agent. He asks the agent, are we good? No, you can't see anything on the thing, but whatever. He sets up his agent, okay? He sets up his agent. This whole week I needed like this so bad. Anyway, and I'm like teaching in the weirdest of places. Anyway, the point is the person's in the east and they want to make an Eruv to the west. He tells the son, make an Eruv for me in the west. Okay, so what happens? Or in a situation where a person is to the west of the town, he tells the son to make an Eruv to the east. So the Mishnah says, if there's a distance between the person and his house, which is 2,000 amos, and the distance to the person's Eruv is more than the 2,000 amos, then the person is allowed to go to his house, but it's forbidden to go to the tchum, to the place where the Eruv is set up, because it's beyond the 2,000 amos that he has. Again, we're assuming the person is over here, right? And their house is over here within 2,000 amos. This is within 2,000 amos. So we say like this. We say and this is beyond that, okay? This is obviously beyond that. This is, I don't know, further, and he wants to set up his Eruv over here. So we say, if the person says, okay, make an Eruv for me in the west direction. We say, if his house is within the 2,000 amos that he has, he doesn't get the Eruv because he still has to, the Eruv has to still be within the place where he lives, where he's standing right now when Shabbos begins. So when Shabbos begins, his Eruv is within the 2,000 amos. Great, so he's able to go as far as his house, but he can't go as far as his Eruv because it's beyond the 2,000 amos that the person actually has, okay? However, Leruvo alpayim ama. Okay, if let's say you have a situation where his Eruv is 2,000 amos or less from within where the person is, we're going to come back and figure out how that makes sense because the house seemingly is always going to be closer than where his Eruv is. But let's say his Eruv is within 2,000 amos, the Eruv is within 2,000 amos, and the house is more. Okay, then asu leveso yosmikan. The house is further. Asu leveso, he's not allowed to go to his house. Umot leruvo, he's allowed to go to the Eruv. Okay. Period. New case. Hanosin is Eruva beibura shel ir. The ibura, again, the word ibura is, so ignore this whole case, but let's say you have a city, which this is where, houses, and then you have a house goes out. Remember we said the word ibur from the word pregnancy. So basically the house, the city is being measured like this, and then the house goes out, right? So this is called the ibura shel ir. Do you remember what you did do in a city like this when you're measuring? You make a line. You say, great, the city actually ends over here. Even though it's only one house, we add a line. So if a person adds an Eruv, places an Eruv over here in the Ibor, this is the pregnancy of the city because we're letting it jut out. We're letting it pop out over here. So Hanosin Yishura B'Ibura, your person may place the Eruv in the extension of the town. Lo Asav Lo Klum. It doesn't change anything because this was already part of the person's city. Right? In other words, if a person lives in this city, this is the person's city, and they go ahead and they place the Eruv over here, it's no different than, this is all part of their house anyways, right? This is all part of their city anyways, so it doesn't actually make a difference. Nothing changes when they place the Eruv over here, it's just placing it within where they live. They live already, their person's house is, let's say, over here. So before placing an Eruv in this situation, what does the person have? The person has 2,000 amos this direction, 2,000 amos this direction, 2,000 amos this direction, 2,000 amos this direction. Then they place an Eruv also within the city, in the pregnancy in the city, where it juts out. It doesn't change anything, okay? However, but let's say they place their Eruv over here. Then what happens is, next page, 60b1, nun samach amud beis, mashen niskar hu mafsid, what you gain in one direction, you lose in the opposite direction. So what that means is as follows, and we've kind of been saying this, but now we're going to say this explicitly. Let's say a person places their Eruv outside of the city. Okay, the terminology in the Mishnah, as you can tell, is a little bit a mistake. It says you place your Eruv beyond your tchum. Now you can't place your Eruv beyond your tchum. That would mean you're placing your Eruv over here when Shabbos began. You're not allowed to place your Eruv beyond 2,000 amos. You have to place it within 2,000 amos, right? So let's say a person places their Eruv a little bit out of the city. So what happens is the 2,000 amos that they have moves over in this direction. And what that means is as follows. In other words, what happens when you place an Eruv? Okay, this is a fundamental question. On Shabbos begins over here. Have you placed an Eruv Tchumen in a while? Probably never. Okay, so what that means is that if we were to go ahead, and we should do this just for a fun exercise, we should one day pull up Google Maps over here, figure out where the Tchum of the city is, and then measure 2,000 amos in every direction. That's basically why, because our house is seen as our house is our residence, not seen as our residence, and the whole city is therefore seen as our 4 amos because we live in Baltimore. And therefore, that's where we live. This whole city is where we live. You live in whatever street you live on in Baltimore. The whole city is your home. And then you measure 2,000 amos every direction. Okay? Now, let's say you set up an Eruv. What happens when you set up an Eruv? What does an Eruv do? What does an Eruv demonstrate? It demonstrates by placing your little food over here, that demonstrates that's your home. It says that's your home. So instead of measuring the 2,000 amos the way we do like this, which is the way, this is Baltimore. So wherever your house is over here, some of you live over here, some of you live over here, it doesn't matter. This whole thing is seen as 4 amos, and we measure 2,000 amos out in every direction. That's what happens in a regular case. But let's say you put your Eruv over here, what that does is it just shifts everything downwards. Instead of it ending over here, which is 2,000 amos, now let's say you put an amma further, so now we just move everything out. So now it's 2,000, it's just basically move this an amma down. So now you have 2,000 amos, which end over here. You have 2,000 amos. This doesn't change. Okay, but in this direction, it changes because instead of having 2,000 amos out over here, your 2,000 amos ends over here. Ends over here because you've shifted your entire residence. Moving your Eruv, what moving your Eruv does is basically shifts the locus of where you begin Shabbos, and therefore, because your Eruv is basically by placing food, I'm saying, this is where I'm starting Shabbos. So wherever it is, it just shifts the 2,000 amos, just start around where that place is. If I didn't set up an Eruv, I just have the 2,000 amos, this is the messiest thing in the world, but the point is that when I'm moving it down, I just shifted my 2,000 amos in every direction, I've shifted it. So what I gain over here, because now I can go a little bit further, I lose on this side. That's what the Mishnah is saying.
Yeah.
You lose further up.
I lose on this side, right? I lose...
Right. No, but isn't it the extension that you lose from? Not from inside the actual city?
Well, we're going to get into the actual city is a little... We'll see. The actual city you could possibly lose, could possibly not lose. Depends on the type of city.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Who does your Eruv include? I guess your family. Let's say your friend decides to join you last minute, and you
That's a good question. Right. So how does that define? Right. How does a person? So it really goes. Each person is defined by themselves. So each person is kind of defined by where they're living. So if they start Shabbos in your home, we're going to get into discussions of that nature. They don't have their own food, but let's say start Shabbos in your home. So it doesn't matter if they have food there, but that's seen as their residence. So if you're traveling somewhere, you're visiting a friend, you have the Eruv of that city because that's where you're sleeping. That's where you're putting your things down.
Right. But I meant the person that changed the Eruv a little.
Does it affect their family members?
Yes, and your friend, let's say your friend and your family members, they have the regular Eruv, but they're with you.
Unless you're doing it explicitly on their behalf, it's not going to impact them.
Okay,
just you. Okay, says the Gemara. Kosel Kadaitach was initially thought by the Amoraim, the way we drew this top picture over here. That Lemizrach, that the case in the Mishnah was that when the Mishnah said a person's to the east, that means they're the east of their house. Lamarav, and to the west means Lamarav Beso, to the west of their house. Okay, so basically, again, this person is to the east of their home, okay, and the Eruv is to the west of their home. When we read the Mishnah said that we should actually put this, everything should be on an equal level. The Mishnah said, if a person is to the east of what? To the east of the world? No. To the east of their home, right? And their Arabs to the west, right? That was the case that the Mishnah laid out, which posed the problem. So Bishlama, it makes sense. When the Mishnah said that you could, right? The Mishnah said in a situation where the 2,000 must reach your house and does reach the Eruv, then the house is included in your Eruv, but the Eruv is not, right? That makes sense. But the case then went on and said, in a situation where your Eruv is closer, and when your Eruv is within 2,000 amos, but your house is further, then it's not going to work. Now, how does that make sense? Your house, if you said, I am to the east of my home, and the Eruv is to the west of my home, then the Eruv is always going to be further away from my home. So what's the case? Okay, the first case makes sense. It says, in a situation where your home is within 2,000 amos, and your Eruv is not within 2,000 amos, then et cetera, et cetera. Then it said, but in a situation where the Eruv is within 2,000 amos, but your home is not, how does that make sense? Your house is always going to come first. So it says the Gemara, Rav Yitzchak misaras lemizrach lemizrach beis lemar lemar beiso lo lemizrach lemizrach beno lemar lemar beno. The case was never the way that it was painted over here, but rather the case when it said to the person when it said that the Eruv is within When it says east and west, it was never talking about the home, rather it's talking about your agent, okay? So your agent was, rather it's talking about your agent. This is your agent. We'll paint him as an A, okay? That's agent. And this is you, okay? So what we're saying over here is that in a situation where the Eruv is to the, then you have the house could be over here and the Eruv is over here. Now it's a little bit more complex, okay? But now the measurements could actually make sense. So what we're saying over here is as follows, right? The Mishnah said, in a situation where your home is within 2,000 amos of your house, of you, then your home is going to be included. In a situation where, okay, let's just redo everything, right? So east and west is no longer east and west of your home. Rather, your home is like this. Right, and your home is like this. The Eruv is like this. Now we're saying if you're within 2,000 amos of your home, great. Then your home is included, and your Eruv is too far. Your Eruv is whatever 300 and whatever, and then the Eruv is not included. But in a situation where the measurements are different, pretend it's not to scale anymore, and rather what we're saying, forget the scaling, but rather the Eruv is now within 2,000 amos, and this is within, this is too far. Then the Eruv is going to be included, and the house is not going to be included. East and west is no longer about you, and the house is not the center, and east and west is about the house, but rather it's about the child or the agent that's measuring for you, and therefore what we're saying, I know the scaling over here is all messed up, but the point is that now we can have a case where the Eruv is actually going to be within 2,000 amos, and the house is not, because it's east and west is not about the house, it's about the person who is the point of reference is the kid or the agent who's doing it for you. Okay, and therefore the Gemara says no problem. However, we have another answer. Rava bar Rav Shila Amar, afilu tim lemizrach beisu lemar beiso, ki go to kai beisei v'lachsono. We say no. Really, the assumption initially was correct, that the east and west was to the house, like we initially assumed, okay? But rather the case is going to be a situation where the person, let's say you're over here, okay, you, the individual over here, your Eruv is over here. So now we can have a case where theoretically there could be a case where this is within 2,000 amos, yeah, within 2,000 amos, and this is going to be further, right? This is 36. But you could also have a case where, no, this is going to be 2,000 amos, and this is going to be 3,000 amos, right? In other words, there's nothing changing it by having it on a diagonal. Then you could have a case where theoretically the Eruv is going to be closer in a situation where the house is going to be closer, and therefore there's no problem from the Mishnah. Again, based on the fact that the house is the point of reference, it could still read this way, and we can still say some scenarios where the house is going to be closer, some scenarios where the Eruv is going to be closer. Okay, says the Gemara further. Hanosin Eruv v'soch ibura. That's the quote from the Mishnah. The Mishnah at the end said, a person placed the Eruv in the extension, and then the Mishnah said, if you place your Eruv 1 amma beyond the tchum. Now that terminology is a little bit misleading, because where do you have to, again, if I want to set up a tchum, let's get rid of all this. We're back to the situation, back to Baltimore, okay? So here is my city, right? Here's my city, and then I have 2,000 amos in every direction. Remember, we square it, make 2,000 amos in every direction. Where do I have to place, if I want to go beyond the city, where do I have to place my Eruv in order to go past the city? Okay, this is 2,000 amos in every direction. I have to place it within the 2,000 amos. If I place my Eruv over here, it does nothing, right? Before Shabbos, I say, I want to go all the way to this city over here. So I place my Eruv over here, it doesn't do anything. I have to place my Eruv within the 2,000 amos. I have to find out where somewhere within 2,000 amos, and then my Eruv works. But the Mishnah said, if I place my Eruv in Amma past the 2,000 amos, now that never works. So the Gemara is bothered and says, what's going on over here? Does the Mishnah mean you can place your Eruv beyond the tchum? The Gemara said, no, ema michutz li bura. What it meant is that you placed your Eruv outside of the Ebor, right? Because the Mishnah was also talking about a case where you have an extension, and it says you basically place your Eruv outside the Ebor, but still within the two. The Ebor is the pregnancy bump, but you place the Eruv within 2,000 amos of the city, and that's the case we're talking about. So don't, in other words, the terminology of the Mishnah was a little misleading because it implied you're placing the Eruv outside the 2,000 amos. That's never going to work. What it was saying is you're allowed to place the Eruv within 2,000 amos. Outside means like outside of this bump, but still within the 2,000 amos. Good? Okay, says the Gemara further. Mashanisker hu mafsid. The Mishnah says what you gain in one direction, you lose in the opposite direction. Ask the Gemara, Mashanisker v'sulo. What you gain in one direction, you lose in the other, but nothing else. So it's time we learned in the Brisa. Hanosin is a person plays an Eruv. Bisoch ibro shel ir, an extension of a town. Lo asav leklum. Don't accomplish anything. In other words, if you place it within the extension, like we saw earlier, you don't gain anything because that's already part of your city. And once you place it 1 amma beyond the extension, but again within the 2,000 amos, mistaker osam, you gain that amma. Now the next page, 60b2. Umafsid is called ir kula, but you lose the entire city. Because the measure of the city, ola lo b'midas atchum, is counted in the measurement of the tchum. Okay, so here the Bryce is telling us something.
That circles a city or an Eruv?
This circle is the city?
The city.
The city.
Okay, that's right. That was-
Okay.
Sorry.
So, no. Please don't apologize. When I ask these questions, it actually tells me like someone's following. Okay. You're all following, I know. But, no. I was saying at least one person is following. At least one person is following. Okay. Okay, so what's the Mishnah saying now? Okay, here is your city. Let's make your city square. Let's make it nice and simple. So the Gemara says, if I don't put my Erev at all, okay, then I have 2,000 amos every direction. If I place my Erev over here, right, then the Mishnah said, then I lose out. Then I lose an amma, I gain an amma over here, I lose an amma over here. But now we have a Bryce which said I actually lose the city. I lose the city, right? In other words, what the way our Mishnah was reading was that instead of having 2,000 amos in this direction, you now have 1,999 in this direction, and because you gained an amma in this direction, so you lose an amma in this direction. That's what our Mishnah said, right? In other words, the starting point is, your city over here, you have 2,000 amos of direction. If I move it over here, our Mishnah said, then now I lose an amma in this direction. I now have 1,999, and I gain an amma over here. Now it's 2,001 amos outside of the city because my Erev has started an amma out. But the Brisa says, no. When I put my Erev over here, then I have nothing over here. The Brisa says, I have 0 over here. Why? Because if I start measuring 2,000 amos, it ends within the city, and therefore I have nothing. So which one is it? In other words, what's happening? And this is what you were touching on before. Over here, let's say my house is smack dab in the middle of the city. Do I count 2,000 amos from my house? No. I count 2,000 from the edge of the city. Okay? But now we start to, sounds like what you're doing is actually, is the city all considered like my place, just one big place like we presented initially? Or as the Brisa now, the Mishnahs over here, or the Mishnah and the Brisa seem to be saying something different. The Mishnah is saying, our Mishnah said if I move my Erev and Alma outside of the city, then I have now 1,999. The Brisa said, I actually have nothing on this side. So how do I reconcile these two things? Let's reconcile, and then we'll try to understand what's going on. So lo kasha, the Gemara says no problem. Kancha calls minos v'chati ir. In the case of the Brisa, my 2,000 amos end in the middle of the town. Kancha calls minos v'sofa ir. Whereas the case of the Mishnah, my 2,000 amos end at the end of the town. Rav Idi, as Rav Idi said, Rav Idi Amar Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Hayamodedu ba, a person was measuring, the chalz minos v'chati ir, and their 2,000 amos end in the middle of the city. Ein lo l'chati ir, you only have where the measurement ends. Chalz minos v'sofa ir, if your measurement ends outside of the city, naslo ir kula karba amos, then the entire town is considered like 4 amos. Umashlim and loas ashar, and then we complete the remainder of him. So Rav Idi introduced us to a new concept, which we've been touching upon the whole time. Rav Idi says like this: if I put my Erev over here, okay, I want to say instead of Erev Tchumen, okay, now I measure. If my 2,000 amos ends over here, okay, then and that's still within the city, then that means all I have is 2,000 amos in this direction, okay. However, which is kind of the Gemara is in touching about, but never said explicitly. If instead of my 2,000 amos ending over here, my 2,000 amos actually ends over here at the edge of the city, like it gets the ends, then we consider this whole thing like 4 amos, and then I have an additional 2,000 amos. See what just happened? If my
It ended where?
at the edge of the city, right? And basically, let's say it goes. Let's just make things simple. It doesn't stop over here. Let's have 2 cases. Let's say one case. Let's just do like this. Yeah, one case I put my Erev over here, and one case I place my Erev over here. If when I measure the 2,000 amos in this direction, my 2,000 amos are ends where the city ends, or beyond that, then this whole city is I treat it like 4 amos, and therefore I'm able to have an additional 2,000 amos. If it ends, like in this case, over here, right? My 2,000 amos end over here, then I can't consider the whole city to be 4 amos, or rather, I measure just 2,000 amos, and that's it. And that's it, right? So if my 2,000 amos ends within the city lines, then then I treat it all as 1 4 amo block, and therefore I'm allowed to have an additional 2,000 amos. If my measurement ends over here, right, then all I have is 2,000 amos. Now, if you're bothered by the fact that it doesn't make sense, don't worry. The Gemara is also bothered by the fact that it doesn't really make too much sense. So the Gemara says, Amrav Idi, Ein elu ela divrei nevios. These words of Rav Yeshua ben Levi are words of prophecy. By saying words of prophecy, what he's saying is that, typically when we come to halacha, we use what we call logic. We use like svara, okay? Prophecy is basically, God says it, right? So a kid, child asks you like, why do you have to do something? So you could say, well, either because this and this reason, because if you don't go to sleep on time, then you're going to be tired tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, because I said so, right? So typically Gemara is in the first category. Nevios, right? But if it comes down to like God said so, okay, well, God said so, right? So when he says different nevios, we're saying basically we don't really understand why. Okay, so he says Mali calls bechati here, Mali calls b'sofi here. What does it matter if it ends over here, The same principle should apply. So Gemara says, Amar Rav. Rav says, no, Tarvayininu. He says, first of all, we learn both of Yeshua and Levi's rulings in the next Mishnah. In other words, you wanted to say, Rav Idi was saying that, I want to be clear, he wasn't saying this as a critique of Rav Yeshua ben Levi. He was saying Rav Idi said this name of Rav Yeshua ben Levi as it must be that there is some Masorah, some tradition. I don't really understand it. In other words, Rav Idi, who said this, I don't know where he got it from. I'm not doubting that he had a tradition. I don't understand where he got it. I can't explain it logically. It must be had a tradition. Rava comes along and says, no, it's not a tradition. It's explicit in the Mishnah. Why? It's another explicit Mishnah. Why? Because we have a Mishnah which says, we'll see soon, the Mishnah says, Anshi Ir Gedola, Mahalchan is called Ir Ketan. The residents of a large town may go through the entire small town. Vein Anshi Ir Ketana, Mahalchan is called Ir Gedola. But the residents of a small town may not go through a large town. So that's what the Mishnah says, and the Gemara is going to try to figure out, the Rava is going to try to interpret this case. So what's the case? You have a big city, and you have a small city. So Rava assumes what we're talking about. So my timer, the Gemara says, what's the reason? When he calls him, he doesn't sofa ear, because the people of the big city, they must have placed an Eruv, okay? They must have placed an Eruv, let's say, outside of their city, okay? And then their 2,000 amos end over here. And the Mishnah said the people of the big city are allowed to travel throughout the entire small city. And then the Mishnah also said if the people of the small city, let's say they placed it over here, could not walk through the entire big city. Why? It must be because their 2,000 amos ended up over here, which is exactly what Rav Idi was telling us. Now, it doesn't explain to us the why, but it's telling us there's a source for it. Don't tell me it's different avios, it's just coming from he has a Masori as a tradition. Look, the Mishnah said, if you're 2,000 amos, the people of the big city, where the line of the Mishnah was, if the people of the big city could walk through the entire small city, the people of the small city cannot walk through the entire big city. It must be the case is where they both place an air between where they live and the 2,000 amos of the big city people they cover the entire small city, and that's why they are allowed to walk the whole entire small city, and they have an additional 2,000 amos. But the people of the small city going up to the big city, their 2,000 amos end in the middle of the big city, and therefore they can't walk the 2,000 amos. So Rava says, look, I have an explicit proof. Rav Levi says, Rav Idi would say, no, anshe, it's not tani. It says the residents of this city and the residents of that city. Umokim lo benosein. And the case, it doesn't say avamode lotnan. It's not talking about a case where a person is measuring 2,000 amos towards the other town. Rather, we're talking about a case where you assumed we're talking about the same case that we were talking about until now, which was you place the Eruv. It says no, where you place the where they place the Eruv over here and you start counting. No, the question was if the people of the small city place the Eruv in the big city and the people of the big city place the Eruv in the small city. That's the case we're talking about. Not a case where you're measuring the 2,000 amos in each direction. It's talking about a totally different case, and therefore it's not talking about a case where you're measuring that Eruv in the middle. Rather, a totally different case, which we'll review tomorrow because we're going to get into the whole discussion. And therefore, Rav Idi says you have no proof from this Mishnah, which we're going to see, to my case, and rather Rav Idi's case is indeed something he learned from a tradition, but wasn't inferred from this Mishnah. Again, we'll come back to this Mishnah, God willing, tomorrow. And once we're on the air, I want to make a big thank you, shout out to Yosh for covering during this whole time, because these past few blot were impossible. So I hope you use this a lot, and I don't know what you used to prepare, but much appreciation. Have a great day.